So Milos VEC is a professor of European legal and constitutional history at Vienna University, and he was a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Science, IWM, in Vienna from 2016 until 2020. He did research at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History until 2011, and has taught also at universities of Bonn, Hamburg, Constance, Lyon, Tübingen, and Vilnius. Until recently, he was on a sabbatical leave as an honorary fellow at the Historisches Kolleg.
Historisches Kolleg. Well, that's another institute of advanced study. Don't worry about pronunciation.
And it's based in Munich. He works also as a freelance journalist, particularly for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and his main focus is the history of international law.
Thank you so much, Aurora. Thank you, Christophe. Thank you, Adrian Schuh, and also Olivier Lepic. My point of departure is quite theoretical. A Frankfurt political scientist has once said that we should imagine human beings as justifying beings. And if you look at the history of chemical warfare, the imaginations about chemical warfare, there is not a vacuum of communication, but you have a lot of writing, thinking, polemics, but also justifications. And I'm concerned about the international legal arguments surrounding chemical warfare, particularly in World War I, and I'd like to analyze those. I'm not talking about the Hague Conventions and the legal provisions. I take this for granted that you know that there has been such a thing, and also that there is a chemical weapons convention and so on. But there is not only international legal arguments, but also other normative orders surrounding chemical warfare, ideas of morality, fairness, military code of honor, chivalry. Some of them have religious grounding, morality itself. So this is why I rather would like to talk about normative pluralism or multi-normativity when it comes to normative ideas about chemical warfare and chemical weapons. At the same time, the tone of morality, of course, is very, very strong in this field. I mean, you have heard the keywords already this morning. There is a towering sound of moral verdicts, poison gas as a barbaric methods. And it goes back, as you said in your introduction already, to Roman law. The ban of poison can be found also transculturally in many writings. And poison gas soon connected to this strand of argumentation. And even the military perceived it, at least partially, as a dishonorable weapon. It is against civilized warfare, against their ideas how to conduct a regular war. Also, if you look at arts and literature, Italian futurism celebrated modernity, but even they did not go so far to celebrate chemical warfare, interestingly. Most of the paintings are very much against and showing really the horrors of chemical warfare. So even in arts and literature, chemical weapons were perceived as mala in se, and the chemical weapons taboo seems to exist in the different normative orders. However, it was used, as we all know, in World War I and in many other places and at other occasions. And there is a number of arguments and defense strategies around this. And as you see from my structure, which is not chronological. It is more systematic, and it's not embedding the arguments in the precise historical context, but it's probably only an overview how this worked. And I'm starting with denial. And here I can immediately connect to Clémence, because there is not only denial, there is also secrecy and confidentiality when it comes to chemical weapons. So very often belligerent parties do not admit that they used chemical weapons. They try to lie about it. And therefore, I have doubts that we can say that basic rules of international law and international warfare were openly disregarded here. On the contrary, very often the belligerent parties seem to disguise this. Also, if you think about, well, you can't think about this, but I have read his text. Usher will be giving his talk in a second, and he says, scientific verification of any kind is a particular challenge during wartime. Battlefields, by definition, are dangerous, inaccessible, and contentious. So in the case of warfare, there is a lot of propaganda, lies, censorship, and so on. So that very often parties try to disguise and to lie about the employment of chemical weapons. Second point, authority. In the case of the Germans, it is quite interesting that Fritz Haber gave a testimony under oath in front of the investigating committee of the Reichstag. And he said, I was never concerned with legality, but the war minister. And now here comes grammatically a very interesting construction, which is full of passive constructions, and it's very unclear who said what and did what, but it is clear attributing the responsibility for checking legality to the war ministry and washing his hands from any responsibility. I don't know if you can call this a blame game. Maybe it is just, I don't know, something else. But it's very interesting that he says, well, I am not concerned with, but somebody else checked this. Third point, this is very peripheral, but there are some people who really claim that the Hague Declarations of 1899 never went into force. And one can, at least consider that what Molly just said, that it is against the spirit of the Hague conferences, or maybe it's even against the word. Fourth point, the provisions of international law were abrogated in World War I. That is legally very interesting. I think that does not work at all, but it's a very interesting argument to say. All the nations had made use of this means of war. These conventions have tacitly been abrogated through violations from both sides, and the subsequent lack of protest against the violations. So it means like you kill somebody on the street and nobody surrounding this murder is protesting against it, and then it's not anymore in the law book somehow. So it's a, so to say, a legal argument from extreme legal realism in favor of military necessity. Then, of course, you all know not all chemical weapons are the same. And once you start this line of argumentation, you end up that some of them are probably legal because they're not causing unnecessary suffering. And one is of this kind, another of that kind, and you can compare it like with dying in a submarine and case of firearms and so on. And here comes again the very famous quote from Fritz Haber from 1923, you can't die more comfortably. Okay, then another argument against the Hague Declarations and the Hague, the whole Hague thing, making war more humane is an illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion, because if you want to fight other nations, other empires, it has to be quick and radical, And there has been always fighting between empires and states and nations. And, you know, behind this is quite a lot of Darwinism. And it is also against the very idea of law of war. Next point, radical othering. I think this is probably underestimated in the context of World War I. And it comes, you know, from an analogy with colonial war. Colonial war worked with a very radical othering of peoples on other continents. So they were barbarians, you know, they had no moral idea, and their uprising was not legitimate. It was not under the regular European law of nations, so the provisions did not apply. And also they had another, you know, physiology. They look different, they fight different. And for that reason, you're entitled to use more radical weapons, which are forbidden in the European context. But if you look at World War I propaganda, it's quite clear that this radical othering happened also within the Western so-called civilized nations. So there was radical othering from the French towards the Germans, like Molly just said, you know, the diabolic Germans, right? And then you are maybe entitled to cross regular boundaries of warfare, and colonial wars and the doctrine of small wars, colonial wars, might have paved this path for these extreme zones of violence, so to say. So European belligerents were labeled as beasts. And here is maybe an interface between some kind of logic and emotion. They come together, they converge, and they are making extreme warfare legal. Finally, a very interesting argument, military necessity. So there is law of war, but sometimes, you know, on the battlefield, a moment of military necessity might emerge. And then you're entitled to jump over, you know, the law of war provisions. You can cross red lines to save, you know, to save lives or so. And then the law of war does not apply. I don't know if this is a general idea of the law of war, but interestingly, it was also promoted from some German international lawyers. I have identified Swiss. I have identified British before World War I who said this is a very German idea. So it is, you know, I try to talk about law as law in context. And the context, of course, is quite national sometimes. And there are different, you know, traditions of doctrine and so on. And at least for the Germans, you can identify some idea of raison de guerre, Kriegsraison, trumping law of war in these constellations of military necessity. And when you look at this, at the law of war, then the law of war is less powerful. It is not binding. Legally, it's not binding. And for some, and this is not only the German military, but even some German international lawyers, they felt like, you know, then the law of war is something like just a mere recommendation, and it could be dismissed in some cases. And state sovereignty is the most important thing, and the honor of the state, and you could even say, in the sense of Machiavelli, self-preservance is much more important than, you know, binding rules and so on. If you don't agree to these arguments, you can still go back, and this is point number 4 on my structure, you can still go back to the idea of reprisals. So all parties in World War I went at some point back to the justification of chemical warfare as a reprisal, or not identical with this, but there is some kind of interface of retaliation. So the others have committed crimes. They previously used chemical weapons, and now we are only doing the same. So otherwise unacceptable use of force could be legal if the requirements of reprisals were fulfilled. They had to aim for satisfaction, be proportionate. They were to be terminated in case the satisfaction was obtained. And thus, this doctrine of reprisals mirrors in many ways just war thinking. These reprisals would in any case cover then the use of chemical warfare as retaliation. This argument shifts the discussion from norms to facts, because then it is only about, who used chemical weapons first, and are we entitled to react to this? And of course, the Germans, they found a lot of occasions where the French, used chemical warfare, chemical weapons before them. And the French, of course, found many occasions where the Germans used chemical weapons first, and also the English and so on. And they all said, so to say, we didn't start the fire. I come to my sixth point on the structure. When you look at this tableau of arguments, I find it very interesting that the assumption that poison gas is subject to a moral and legal taboo is historically quite questionable. Because all these, sources I'm referring to, they say, well, chemical weapons are legal in principle or exceptionally legal, or there is something like military necessity or the idea of reprisals. So to say it with the words of a colleague, Eric Lindstrom, who has just published a book, and he says this story, and he's referring to chemical weapons in domestic context. He says this is a story about the fluidity of the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate weapons. And particularly when you go back to this wartime and interwar time discussion, you see that this debate is dominated by ferocious nationalism. So international law is not entirely an international discussion or an international discourse, but the people contributing to this, they are constructing this normative order, they are applying this normative order, they're interpreting it, they're implementing the law of war. They have their own background. And in the case of the outbreak of World War I, they decided for backing up their own governments very often, even after censorship was lifted, even after World War I was over. So, with other words, the international attempt of a juridification of war before 1914 was cancelled in 1914 and after by patriotism, militarism, and extreme wartime nationalism. My seventh point is the interwar discussion about the doctrine of reprisals in international law. So when you look at this discussion, the liberal international lawyers, so to say, they realize that this international law is not only a law of peace and a procedure to avoid conflicts, but on the contrary, it contributed to the escalation of conflicts. It contributed to the radicalization of warfare, which went beyond self-help, as in the case of gas warfare. So even excessive violence was made acceptable by labeling it as lawful. So Albrecht Mendelssohn Bartholdy, he said the idea of military necessity and reprisals are two enemies of international law. And chemical warfare was one of his core examples. Also, Heinrich Lammatsch said, this is an instrument to unhinge international law. So once you label people as barbaric criminals, this exactly happens in a legal frame. My last point is divided into three subpoints. This story could be told in much more details, and of course I'm lacking many, justifications, other justifications, and so on. But what I made invisible by this talk is perhaps the contrary. What I thought is so interesting that in many occasions we are interestingly lacking a justification of the employment of chemical weapons. Like, when the Germans employed chemical weapons on the Western Front on April 22, we don't know what they really thought. It's not on the records. And maybe it was in the archive, which burned down in 1945. But I think there is some analogous evidence in other cases that people don't think about the legality. It's not disclosed to the public. It's kept a secret. So the absence of legal and moral justification of the employment of chemical weapons is a very interesting point. I think this is maybe a structural absence. So this is my second subpoint here. Are human beings really justifying beings? Maybe sometimes they're not justifying beings. And then we can think, is this because the chemical weapons taboo is a taboo and you can't justify the breach of a taboo? But I mean, from my primary sources, you see there are a lot of justifications flying around, and they were spoken out by the military, by politicians, by international lawyers. So this is an open question. We have to accept sometimes the factual absence of justification. And the last subpoint is, how do we deal as historians, legal historians, political scientists, with this interpretation of quietness? What does it mean when justifications are lacking or absent? Is it because the breach of a taboo can't be justified? I don't know. And how do we approach this? Like, do we engage with more energy in searching the archive for justification, or are we addressing the fact of the absence, and or are we entering a forbidden zone of speculation? Many thanks for attending.